So I'm talking to almost all of the contributors to 5 by 5 today. Sarah James couldn't join us, but she's done us a recording, which is very kind of her. And 5 by 5 was the first of what was going to be a series. It actually ended up just being 2 books of collections where we had only a very few contributors, but they each got to really show this, what they were made of, and give us several stories or poems. So hence 5 by 5, 5 contributors, 5 pieces each. So that side, here we all are. And all of these authors we had published before, and they were invited to contribute, and I'm very pleased with the outcome. And so I've got Joan Taylor-Rowan, Katy Darby, Helen Morris and Cassandra Passarelli with me, and they keep going, yeah, but what are we doing, Cherry? I don't really know. We're just going to chat, okay? So just go with it. Cassandra, talk to us about your stories.
Trying to think what I can say about my stories. They were a collection of stories that were written, I guess, fairly early on in my short story writing process, and they were all clustered around a time that I was living in Guatemala. So they have a very strong sense of place and where I was at the time, and I was struggling with a lot of conflicts that were in Guatemala, and the amazing beauty of the place and all the contradictions of living there. And I think those probably permeate the stories and shape what I wrote during that period. I guess I'm writing very different stuff now, and that's just the natural way that things move and people's lives, our rhythms, our interests and circumstances change. But it was a very important period of my life, very formative period of my life. And those stories are very important to me because of that. And it was really nice to have them in that sort of grouping together of 5. I think it was a nice, healthy, comfortable number to put together without having to do a full-blown collection. As a nice stepping stone, and I think for a reader it's a much more pleasant experience. I guess sometimes what you hear people say about short stories, I think mistakenly, because I love short stories, but it's hard to get your teeth into them, whereas I think with all of us, with the 5, you get a much better sense of each author, of what their body of work is like, and the sort of similarities and differences between each story, and they kind of build on each other in layers. So yeah, I think that's pretty much all I can think of off the top of my head to say about them.
Your stories are very political. Yeah, even the one about selling pineapple by the side of the road is about the banana cartels and the appalling way the workers are treated and the monopolies and all of that, and which I had no idea about until I read this. And so very careful who I buy my bananas from ever since. That really felt like an interesting take, because it's people getting on with their normal lives, but with all this politics behind it that just sort of seeps in because it can't not, which I really love. So thank you for all your contributions.
I think that's still there, and it still seeps into my work. Yeah. I mean, I think whether I'm writing about coronavirus or current things in Devon, which is where I'm living now, I think that's inevitable, because I think the political picture always informs the microcosm. I think perhaps now my work is less overt in that, and perhaps it's more subtle, but it's still underpinning everything that I write. And I think it's probably one of the few places, you know, that people have that freedom of expression to be able to have dialogue with political ideas without them being either in a newspaper tirade or online in a sort of Facebook format, where you don't have to worry about that quick reaction, but you can actually explore something. And I think that that's really unique and precious and important for writers. And we shouldn't be afraid of entering into that arena, because it's obviously crucial to all of our lives.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Waiting room. Stepping in from the noise and chaos of the street, Julia took in the rows of plastic chairs. The front ones occupied by women, the ones at the back by men, like in church. They faced the altar, the secretary's large desk piled with stacks of buff folders. The congregation looked as if time had been postponed. Their eyes, fixed on the secretary with distilled numbness, shifted to Julia. "The doctor told me to come." Julia wondered if the secretary knew. A hunchback with a tired face in a yellow t-shirt hugging her high shoulders, she indicated to sit down. Perhaps she was tired of talking. Perhaps it was forbidden to speak in this tabernacle. Julia chose a front seat, regretting it at once. The room smelled of burnt toast. Two small girls popped their heads out of a doorway behind the secretary's desk. The smaller one came in with a plastic cup and filled it at the water dispenser. Julia stared at the tiled floor, then at a framed hygiene certificate. Waiting room. Stepping in from the noise and chaos of the street, Julia took in the rows of plastic chairs. The front ones occupied by women, the ones at the back by men, like in church. They faced the altar, the secretary's large desk piled with stacks of buff folders. The congregation looked as if time had been postponed. Their eyes, fixed on the secretary with distilled numbness, shifted to Julia. "The doctor told me to come." Julia wondered if the secretary knew. A hunchback with a tired face in a yellow t-shirt hugging her high shoulders, she indicated to sit down. Perhaps she was tired of talking. Perhaps it was forbidden to speak in this tabernacle. Julia chose a front seat, regretting it at once. The room smelled of burnt toast. Two small girls popped their heads out of a doorway behind the secretary's desk. The smaller one came in with a plastic cup and filled it at the water dispenser. Julia stared at the tiled floor, then at a framed hygiene certificate on the wall. A woman with a tiny baby swaddled in a synthetic blue blanket came in. Julia, like the others, watched her. A door swung shut behind the curtained hallway and a pregnant woman emerged, clutching her folder with a confessor's relief. Two women behind Julia followed her out.
So it's always great to be in such prestigious company. So hello, ladies. So I always feel slightly the odd one out because obviously I work for the council rather than actually being a proper writer. But so my short stories, I think, so my brain is like a junk shop. It's full of stuff. It's very eclectic. And I think my stories are like that. They're stuff full of words and adjectives and metaphors and anything else that I can ram in there, like one of those tiny bijou junk shops that you go into and there's just stuff everywhere. Most of it's clutter, but every now and again there's something quite interesting. In my short stories, I did actually just have to Google because I could remember 4 of them and I couldn't remember what the 5th one was. But that's down to other things going on in life. So Long was the first short story I ever wrote. And so that has a very special place in my heart. It had a single plot line to start with. And then I remembered from my childhood that Blake 7 always had something going on the ship and something going on the planet. And so I added a second one, which was quite fun. And so that's one I'm particularly fond of for that very reason. Troll is probably one of my favourites. I don't like to have favourites because it seems a bit bad. Troll, again, I'm quite moralistic, and a lot of my stories are like twisted fairy tales, and I think that's one that very clearly is. Obviously it's based on 3 Billy Goats Gruff, stolen shamelessly, and it was really about all 3 of my sons are neurodiverse. I've got 2 dyslexic and an auti, and the world is a hard place to be neurodiverse in, and so it's about standing up. It's also, I'm one of 3 sisters, so there are 3 sisters in it, and I'm also an Essex girl, so their 3 Essex skills. So that's that one. Telling the Bees is one that I find very hard to read myself. It's about the loss of a child. I grew up on a respite, as a part of a respite foster scheme for severely disabled children. And so quite a lot of children came through my life when I was a child who died very early. So I think Kerry was 3, Nikki was 14, and Niall was 21. So there was a sense of watching families have a really hard time and then lose their children very young. So very much, but also there was always hope. So hope is a big theme of all my stories as well. So that was that one. Memories was, I was just thinking, what would it be like to write a story in real time, so that the amount of time that passed was the amount of time with the story, and it was set around the bus stop opposite the house where I grew up. So excellent bus stop themed story there. And this is where I've forgotten what the other ones are. But the other thing I liked about the 5 was that I realised by accident they all had female protagonists. So that was another thing in that very eclectic mix of stories that I liked. But what I really liked about the whole anthology was the diversity. So it was, you know, there wasn't a single story that was like another, and the very different authorships really came through. And the launch party was great fun, although I do remember being attacked by a wasp in the middle of the reading, and I really hate wasps. So that was the adrenaline was already high enough without a bloody wasp turning up. So
the other one was Simon Le Bon Will Save Us, which you
yes.
you read at the story sessions,
Yes.
or rather, no, you didn't read it.
Carrie read it.
Carrie read it, and she roped
Yes.
Barbara Rennell in to do the singing with her, which was
yes,
which she hadn't signed up for, but she did it. It was great. It was
that one was
mad.
that one was literally written in about 40 minutes when a friend phoned me up on about 11 o'clock on New Year's Eve and said, "Oh, Helen, by the way, I'm going to an 80s themed New Year's Eve party, and I've said I'll read a story. Can you just knock one up for me? It has to have a musical theme track because it's the, you know." So what they did was read a bit, play the track, everyone danced. Obviously everyone was dressed up to the nines. I wasn't able to go because it was in Bristol and I was in Essex, which I thought was outrageous. So that one was literally written, and my sisters were massive Duran Duran fans. I was David Bowie. They were not quite that classy. So it was written all around Duran Duran and the music of the time. So I literally had to go on Google. I can't remember which year it was 81 or 82, work out what song was playing in what month, because I was, so that was in many ways being set such a clear brief. I need it tonight, and it has to have 7, I think, songs or however many it was for us to play during. It was quite helpful. But yeah, that was that was, I think, about the second short story I'd ever written. So that's the story behind that story.
Hey, thank you.
And so people start to avoid the bridge. They zigzag by other paths. The babbling flow becomes a trickle. Waterloo Bridge becomes grey shaded and unloved. It stiffens. It grows tired. It loses hope. But there is always hope. There is always hope. One spring Friday, the crepuscular rays of evening are turning the river gold and burnt orange. The air still grips the chill memory of winter. The odd rat scuttles along the gutter, sniffing, making sure it is always within a metre of a human. From the deep chocolate shadows, 3 Essex sisters trap towards the bridge, their shadows stretching like black silk opera gloves. The rat turns and sniffs the air expectantly. The sisters stop in a pool of light that oozes from the street lamps like warm jam. The youngest holds up a hand with Diamante stars embedded immaculately in each nail. She tilts her head and points at the south bank. which is glowing and winking with promise, a sparkling stellar meringue. We want to go there, she says, and she takes a single brittle step forward. But quickly the second sister steps close behind her, her breath involuntarily held, and rests a protective hand upon her shoulder. But what about the troll? She whispers, fear making her voice small. What about the troll? And both sisters look with dread towards the span of Waterloo Bridge stretching out before them. Then the eldest sister steps close behind them both and lays a strong hand on each sister's shoulder and says in a voice as firm as lichened rock, "Do not be afraid of the troll." The three sisters turn to each other and fold and gather themselves around as tight as a woven willow basket, and they whisper a plan as so many of London's secrets are whispered. And after clenched minutes they unfurl like spring leaves and stand and stretch, the lights reflecting brightly in their faces. The youngest tosses her auburn hair and slicks a fresh lick of hot pink lipstick across her mouth. "I ain't scared of no troll," she says, and off she sets across the bridge. Trip, trap, trip, trap, her footsteps ringing out across the deserted bridge until she reaches the middle. And the troll slouches up from the parapet where he had been leaning and strolls his lazy troll-like stroll, rolling like a tar barrel where the tar has hardened off-centre. He stands astride the path, hitches up his jeans and blocks the youngest sister's way. Right, you ready? "Who's that trip-trapping over my bridge?" he roars, eyes popping and arms stretched out wide. "It's me," says the youngest sister, cooler than a forest floor on an autumn morning. "Who's asking?" The troll snorts. He steps closer, and even the bricks in the bridge try to shrink from him. "I'm going to troll you up," he says, and he takes out his smartphone and presses the phone app with a trolley thumb. "Oh no," says the youngest sister, arms crossed and gaze steady. "You don't want to do that. You want to wait for my sister. She's much more of a slapper than me. Don't waste your time trolling me." The troll wrinkles his nose. He sniffs. He contemplates this information. There is a pause. A tug noses its way beneath the bridge. The troll considers. He speaks. "Well then," he says, "I've not got much battery left, to be honest. Be off with you. I'll wait for your sister." And he steps to one side, leering. The youngest sister rolls her eyes and trip-traps across the bridge, down the South Bank steps and into a cocktail bar. There she slides smoothly onto a shiny circular stool and orders 3 margaritas. "Bring it on," she whispers to the expectant air.
Katy, you seem to be momentarily child-free. Do you want to have a go?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sorry. So we're talking about our own stories in the books. Yeah, I was just trying to remember which ones are in there, but so
Tyburn Jig.
Tyburn Jig. The Quarantine is probably the one chronologically first.
Cuckoo, the Nuisance,
Cuckoo.
and the Co-Respondent.
Oh yeah, that's right. Okay. So yeah, again, I think what Helen was saying about the variety, not only between the authors, but within the authors' stories, is one of the things I really like, and I think it's one of the things that a collection can do and an anthology can do in a different way. But this is kind of a combination of both, really. It's like an anthology of mini collections, so we get a flavour of each author's voice, but we also get a sense of their range. And that's one of the things that I particularly like, from both from short stories in every form, from collections or anthologies. So let's
start with Quarantine. So that is kind of near future science fiction, probably written about 10 or 15 years ago, something like that. It was first published, it was actually written like before it was published, several years before it was published. I wrote it, sent it out a few places, didn't get anywhere. And then Dyslexia had a theme on infection or disease or something like that, or contagion. And I was like, oh, I've got a story that'll fit, dug it out, gave the ending. You know, when you could sometimes look at stories after a couple of years, you're like, oh, that's what's wrong with it. And I was just like, oh no, the ending's terrible. That's what I have to do. I have to fix the ending. And then it was accepted. So it's republished here. But it's about a world, hard to imagine, I know, where a pandemic has forced lockdown for everyone. You know, you have to kind of go around in masks and gloves, sterile cabs, that sort of thing. There's a fetish for sterility and certain sterilization, I should say, and certain people can be genetically enhanced to be more resistant to the disease, but most people have got it and are living with it. So it's kind of somewhere between, it's not something that immediately kills you, but it's a condition, kind of AIDS style. And it's about someone going on a date in that world. There's two historical ones, or one or two. So there's two. There's Tyburn Jig, which is the late 18th century one, which is when I was doing a lot of research and reading about. I just had loads of books on Newgate prisons and punishment, and because I was writing a book where one of the characters goes to Newgate, but all the kind of biographies of Newgate or criminal London, they range through the whole history, understandably. They're not just like Victorian Newgate. So I was reading a lot of stuff about the 18th century prisons and the hangings and punishments and you know, the trail down what is now Oxford Street to Tyburn Tree, the Triple Tree, where you would just get hanged if you committed a crime and been convicted of it. Then, you know, they'd sentence you on Monday and you hang on Friday. It was very, very quick. So yeah, just reading all that stuff about the various kind of dodgy characters who've been in Newgate Jail, which is sort of in the city, and there was a trip, there'll be like a tumbrel going through the town on a bank holiday effectively. So our character is Sarah, who's watching her husband go to hang for the murder of his mistress, and she's following all the stages from Newgate to Tyburn, and they would stop a couple of times because there'd be huge like festival crowds going to see the hanging, and they'd follow the carts all along, and they'd stop in pubs, and the prisoners would get out, have a drink, cuffed, you know, come back and, you know, kind of josh with the crowd, I'll get you a drink on the way back, that sort of thing. So yeah, as we watch her husband kind of progress towards his death, we have a kind of she's remembering what happened and how it kind of led to this, and we have a kind of twist as to the nature of the crime and how guilty he is of it. So yeah, I really enjoyed writing that one. There's The Cuckoo is just like a creepy bedtime story inspired by a fireworks night where I think I was quite small and I got lost. And I was just really, really scared because obviously you're not really out after dark that much as a kid. But Guy Fawkes is one exception. And it's very exciting, but it's also pretty scary. And there's big crowds and it's dark. And anyway, I just imagined, you know, a child who got lost and then is sort of somewhere between a fireworks night and a fun fair. So he becomes a prize in the fun fair. The Correspondent, I have a great fondness for. I was really pleased that Cherry picked it. I'm just trying to remember what inspired it. Oh, I think it was some sort of competition. Oh, you know what it was? It was like Versace or someone like some like designer brand had a competition for writing about that involved glasses, that, you know, spectacles for seeing or something. And so I thought, oh, I'll you know, I'll use a character who needs glasses, but, you know, doesn't want to wear them for reasons of vanity or, you know, for reasons of practicality. And I can't even remember if that's still in the story, but originally the character needs specs. And basically, when she takes them off, then she can't see very well. But yeah, that was what it was. I thought I'd do a kind of wartime narrative, sort of kind of between the walls. Yeah, just because it's a period I really liked, and the Canadian, the co-respondent character, the gentlemanly Canadian, is inspired by my ex. I don't think he's ever read it, but I think it would amuse him. And I'm just trying to remember what the last one is. Oh yeah, sorry, that's the one I read, isn't it? That's the one I read at the launch. Yeah, so that's probably one of the longest ones, and that was first published in Slice magazine in the US. That's the one that got me my agent, and then eventually published the novel with her. Yeah, so that's just a kind of what if story about what would happen if a miracle happened to somebody who's very ordinary, not only very, very ordinary, she's a, you know, suburban housewife, but somebody who doesn't have any faith. So basically she's kind of living her life, you know, she's somewhat depressed and isolated, you know, it's not perfect, but she's kind of just got a son, she looks after him and all the rest of it. And she begins to manifest stigmata on her hands, and she sort of goes to the doctor about it, and the doctor is the one who becomes kind of slightly obsessed with the idea that this is a miracle, and it's, you know, she should be accepting it rather than trying to get rid of it. And yeah, and then there's the kind of the fallout from that, really. But so many of them are what ifs, I think. You can do that. I mean, that's a principal question of fiction, let alone science fiction. That you ask yourself this question, of kind of idly listening to something or reading something, and you think, oh, wouldn't that be interesting, you know, or here's a story that I could tell, or here's a kind of, you know, potential way in which this might be even more interesting. So I think I probably did that with all of the situations. But yeah, it's really nice to kind of see them all together and have them gathered with their pals.
Yeah, you're so good at titles. I think the Nuisance for developing stigmata is just hysterical.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's meant to recall, you know, a kind of phrase for periods, obviously, because it's blood that appears on a regular basis. But yeah, no, I had a whole range of stories. For a long time, I was like, I wanted to call it the something, the single word, and I was kind of envisioning collections. So the correspondent is one of them as well. And I just had various different ones, and I just thought, yeah, understatement is the way forward, isn't it? Nicely ambiguous too, the Nuisance.
If she's lucky, her feet and side won't start bleeding until the second day. For some reason, the hands always come first. She stumbles in through the door, keys shaking in her hand. Sometimes when the Nuisance is coming, she gets dizziness too, and fleeting pinpoint headaches. This is one of those times. She heads for the kettle and peels off her outer gloves with trepidation as she waits for it to boil. The dressings underneath the thin white rubber are still clean, apart from 2 bright blotches of red at their centres. They'll be good for another couple of hours. She remembers with a rush of relief that James has somebody's leaving due this evening. He won't be home till late. Plenty of time to make preparations, in case it's not just the hands that start tonight. She pours her tea and sits at the kitchen window, balancing the mug on top of the radiator to keep it warm. The rain has stopped, and the garden outside is dripping, striped and spangled with afternoon sun. She has an hour before she has to pick up Matty from nursery. Preparing the dinner can wait. Upstairs, she takes the maroon towels from their place at the back of the airing cupboard. In the bathroom, she removes the dressings and plasters and flushes them down the toilet before stripping completely and stepping into the tepid bath. Hot water increases the bleeding. Slender trails of red snake from her pale hands, distorted through the angle of the water, but she soaps and scrubs as best she can. Once she has dried herself on the dark towels, she stands naked in front of the long mirror to examine her whole body in the hard white light. Hands first. The wounds are still superficial, but are bleeding freely, if more lightly now. They will only get worse. She'll probably need some more gauze before it's over. She slaps a couple of small plasters on them to stem the flow while she looks over the rest of her. She doesn't want to mess up the bathroom floor. In the mirror, she watches herself narrowly as she lifts up her left arm, and then her right, as though for a breast exam, running her fingers along the spaces between the stretched ribs, feeling for a gap or cleft. The chest wound has appeared twice so far, each time on a different side, as though trying to work out where it ought to be. The holes in her palms have once or twice migrated to the base of her hands, almost at the junction of her wrist. Fortunately, that was in November. She had bought long, faux suede gloves, which James had admired. She can feel and see no break in the skin, but she will wear her black thermal vest under her pyjamas tonight, just in case. She bends abruptly at the waist to stare at her feet. There is still worn pink polish on her toenails from drinks with Tom and Wendy last Saturday. She grabs cotton wool pads and nail varnish remover and rubs the ragged remainder off while she examines her soles minutely. The left foot is clear, but the right is beginning to rupture and smudges red on the floorboards as she lifts it to check, wobbling on one leg like a dazed flamingo. For safety's sake, she hops to sit on the closed lid of the toilet where she bandages both feet, top and bottom, opens the Veruca socks and drags them on, pulling her normal socks over them. No tights or open-toed shoes for a few days. Both feet will probably be showing the injuries by morning. She remembers the depressing squelch of a sock full of blood from last time. Panty pads work best to line them, but it's difficult to fiddle them in. She checks her watch and dresses again in double time, only 15 minutes before she has to collect Matty. No time to call a taxi, and anyway, Matty doesn't like changes in his routine. She'll walk, as usual. The pain in her feet won't start properly until tomorrow, if she's lucky. The plasters on her hands will have to do. She slips an extra layer of cotton wool under the surgical gloves and puts the leather ones back on. Her fingers are already stiff and slow. She has a suspicion that if she held her naked palms up to the strong overhead bulb, she would already be able to see a drop of light through them. At the nursery gates, one of the other mothers asks her where she got her gloves. "You've always got such lovely accessories," she says, and twinkles her rings in goodbye.
Hi everyone. Yeah, I mean, I too loved having like 5 together, and it was quite tricky deciding what would be the ones, which stories would be the ones. And mine, I suppose, as everyone has said, I never think I have a particular voice, but clearly everyone who knows me says they'd pick out one of my stories a mile away, which is quite interesting, isn't it, when you can't see it yourself? Although when I read these together, I could see certain things coming up again and again. Mine are wide ranging in as much as one of these is very historical, but the others are sort of a mix of my own experience, sort of, you know, shoehorned in. Oops, sorry. Okay, I'm just finishing something on my screen. My own experience sort of woven into, again, a sort of what if scenario. So I suppose the oldest one on here is the one called The Bet, which is a kind of coming of age story set against the background of the Eurovision Song Contest, and involves sibling rivalry, but also the rivalry between the mother, who's from Northern Ireland and feels Irish, and the children who are very English, and how that's played out against the family background of Irish relatives living in the Troubles. And it was the first time I think I'd really deliberately tried to have those 2 events which seemed disparate but somehow fed into each other. And it was quite, and once I had the idea of doing that, it seemed to come quite easily, and I had fun writing about the Eurovision Song Contest because it was a family thing. People, I don't know, people do that a bit now. I suppose when you watch Gogglebox, you can see that people do, but we would always gather around to watch it, to compare, to give our opinions. And I am still a watcher of the Eurovision Song Contest. And that was, you know, quite, and that one was, I think, the second story I got picked up for. I think I got the shortlisted in the Asham Award for that, which I don't even know if still exists, but anyway. So that was very exciting. And then after that, I think I wrote, I'm trying to think which one. The others were fairly close together, actually. Never Knowingly is probably everybody else's favourite story. Whenever I read, everyone loves this story because it's set in John Lewis. And it was the idea that wouldn't it be great if life was like John Lewis? And I remember having an experience. It just happened to be, I was very unkind to Argos in this, but having gone to Argos where there was a really stroppy girl serving me, and then I had to go and pick something up from the John Lewis collection department, and they were so polite and the seats were comfortable and they weren't ripped and stuck together with masking tape or whatever. And I just imagined it was just when all those adverts were coming out about, you know, Christmas adverts, you know, giving this wonderful idea of what Christmases are like. And I was thinking then, well, supposing your Christmas isn't like this because it was sort of recession time, and supposing that's the advert that's being fed, what about if you just combine those two? What about you made homeless and you moved into John Lewis? And it was funny how much that really somehow hit. I afterwards I heard about the film Terminal, which I hadn't actually seen at the time, where someone ends up living in the airport, but somehow John Lewis just fed into everyone's secret fantasies. And so I'd got a certain way, and then I thought, well, how is this story going to move forward? And I just thought, there's got to be someone else living there too. And then once I thought of that idea, that the couple find another couple living there, that I think is what made it work, really. But anyway, so that was a fun one to write, and it's lovely to read it because people really, you know, it always gets a very positive response. So that was a good one. But in that regard, anyway. Now of the other three, The Dress is quite a sad story. I've never read this one out really, and it was actually inspired by my mother's sewing machine. And my mother taught me to sew on the sewing machine, and it was always in our house, that corner thing of the sewing, and I learnt to sew on it, and I'm an avid dressmaker and textile teacher I was, and the idea of this machine sort of start representing what happened on it, representing the movement of a life, you know, that you start by making you bring material back from your honeymoon, you have that, but you end up not making anything yet, but then you have your children, you make things for them, and then as you go through your life, or what about if you made the dress that you want to be buried in on the same machine? And that's where that idea sort of came from. And I wanted to try and make it quite tense between what the daughter wanted for the mother and what the mother wanted for herself. And obviously, like most of us of this age, you've gone through periods of losing people, so you know, it was interesting to try and write about that. So that was sort of one of my few dressmaking stories where I get to talk about patterns and dressmaking tissue and and tailor tacks. So that was quite fun to write, and although it's quite a sad theme.
Hi, I'm Joan Taylor-Rowan, and I'm going to read an extract from my story called The Dress, which is in 5x5. I've never read this story aloud before, so I'm really pleased to be doing it for the anniversary of this book. The Dress. I know I must finish this dress. I abandoned it years ago, left it in the sideboard with the pattern still pinned in place. The tissue has yellowed, but the cut fabric has no dusty crease marks. It's shantung silk with a square piece missing from one corner. I bought it on our honeymoon in Hong Kong. I didn't know what I was buying then, but its shimmer was irresistible. Michael paid for it, far too much, but it's lasted. I have always sewn, always loved the feel of fabric, the smell of the starch, the bump of it on the counter as the salesgirl pulls out the yardage. Corrine phones just as I am working on the tailor tacks. They'll still be there when I pull the tissue pattern off, a delicate map of construction, like sutures holding a skin together.
"Hi, Mum. How you doing?" I say I'm fine, of course. It's what she needs to hear. "I'm making a dress," I tell her. There is a pause, and I feel irritated and then desolate. Lately I've noticed her eyes flicker over the books I buy, measuring them, afraid that I might end before they do. "It's just some old thing I cut out years ago. I'll probably never finish it, but it's something to do." "Better than watching Cash in the Attic," she says. "Exactly," I say, laughing. "I'll call it Cloth in the Cupboard." She laughs too, a burst of sound, a release. She tells me about the children, and I can hear them in the background, squealing and giggling, and I want to hug them. She tells me she'll be around later. She has cooked me something. I place the phone back and notice how thin my hands are getting. I begin by joining the bodice together, pinning the seams, delighted that I can still estimate 5/8 of an inch with such accuracy. The dress has a 7-part bodice with princess seams and a shawl collar which comes together in a twisted knot. That piece, laid out flat, looks unpromising, a backward question mark, to begin a sentence with a doubtful ending, perhaps. I chose the design when I was slender with love. In the pattern books, full of lean models with Arctic expressions, this one stood out. The girl in the illustration looked as newly married as I felt, her hands grabbing the skirt's fullness at either side as if she was preparing to leap. I got as far as the pinning, spreading the fabric out in the sparse living room of our first flat. It looked so perfect that I lay down and wrapped it all around me. In that moment, with the sun on my eyelids, I felt completely happy. 3 months later, my waist had begun to vanish, an expansion that both fascinated and alarmed me. I stroked my growing belly, wondering who on earth I was making. Corinne arrived, voracious and eager to grow. 18 months later, Kathy was born. Over the next 7 years, the unfinished dress in its paper bag disappeared under the holiday snaps, Christmas cards, and Kathy's exuberant paintings, just an archaeological curiosity from another life. The sewing machine is a treadle, but it runs a treat. It was a wedding present from Michael's mother. It lasted longer than our marriage. It has always occupied the same corner of the room. Unlike Michael, it didn't need more space. The machine sits on its purpose-built table. Vintage, they describe it now, like me, I suppose. But I made all their clothes on this, sitting in the living room, laughing at the TV, listening for the sound of their hands clattering on the door knocker. I search around in the drawer looking for the bobbin and its case. I turn the hand wheel and the needle rises. I feel a little surge of pleasure as my feet rock back and forth, even though my hip aches and the pain in my stomach makes me giddy with nausea. By the time I hear Corinne's key in the lock, I have the entire bodice constructed. It's astonishing sometimes to watch my daughter move around the room, fixing, plumping and adjusting pillows, to think that I created her, my DNA like a skein of thread, stitching the blue of her eyes and the red of her hair. I see Michael in her too, less evident, but there in her gestures, her robustness. At last she sits down and pushes the tea towards me, her eyes anxious. "I'm feeling fine," I tell her before she asks. "Really, a lot better than last week anyhow." She looks towards the sewing machine and back at me, quizzically. "You haven't used that in years. Why?" And then her chin puckers, that little crease forms between her brows. She picks up a scrap of the fabric that has fallen on the floor. I know she has recognised the shiny threads. I take a sip of my tea. Its heat burns my throat. "I was thinking about the dress I made for your first day at school." Corinne nods. "Do you mean the one with the apple blossom pattern on it, all greens and pinks, like a painting?" "Yes, that's it. I bought the fabric in Macready's when it was still a department store. I made one for you and one for Kathy. I have a picture somewhere of the two of you under the apple tree wearing those dresses." We rarely talk about Kathy these days, and I can see from the dip of her head that she's wondering what it means, though she tries hard to hide her emotions. "Kathy's was a different shape, though," she says quietly, twisting the thread of silk between her fingers. It was sleeveless because you ran out of material, so you put lace around the neck of hers, and I cried because I wanted lace on mine. She clears her throat, gulps her coffee. You're right. Fancy you remembering that. I alter the photo in my mind, adjusting it to match her recollection. Gosh, all those things I made for you. The fairy costumes, those shorts you both hated, the party frocks. The clothes danced inside my head, lit by the vibrancy of my memories. You never taught me to use the machine, Corinne says. She had forgotten that I tried once, but she was too impatient. She gave it up for a game of hopscotch with the girls next door. I came back after lunch and found Kathy, aged 7, perched on the chair, her face screwed up in concentration as she joined 2 bits of fabric together with an erratic line. It was the beginning of a brief but intense love affair. When she cut out the square of my honeymoon silk to make an evening dress for her doll, I banned her from the sewing machine and I made her hand back the material. I can't bear to think now about how angry I was. It was as if the last hope for my marriage had gone. She stared at me aghast as I cried and cried. Kathy was the one with the creative streak, Corinne says suddenly. She took after you in everything. She bites her lip, realising what she has implied, and looks stricken. I didn't mean... Oh, Mum, I'm sorry. I wave my hand to show it doesn't matter. My darling Kathy, the wrong fabric perhaps, a faulty design, a built-in obsolescence that I could do nothing about. We didn't know about genetic disorders then, but I feel guilty just the same. So what have you cooked for me? I ask her, because even now we can't talk about the things that matter. I've begun saying that I love her on the phone, and I can tell without seeing her face that she's blushing. I know it's the best I can get from her, the best she can do. Kathy would have been different, and I'm ashamed of that thought. She opens her bag and pulls out a container of brightly coloured stew. Good Lord, I say, it reminds me of a Mexican sunset. Moroccan, she says, pleased. It's a vegetable casserole. It's full of antioxidants. I grimace at the word. It sounds like something that will remove rust. All the articles online say they really work, she says. They say a lot of things, I mutter. Maybe you should try another course of chemo, she says, her eyes catching mine. I know exactly what my body needs, I say. Her mouth droops, and I wish I could snatch back those words. Everything I say now leaves an imprint. I try to scrutinise each phrase, judging its effect, before I lay it out before her. I conjure up a little smile. Does it taste good? That's what I want to know. She opens the lid, and all my holidays return to me in one gush. Turmeric and ginger, tomatoes and cumin. I close my eyes and remember the trip with Michael on the ferry to Kowloon, our clothes sticking to our bodies, the sun a white beach ball in that impossible sky. I won't be able to eat it, but I keep smelling it and listening to her voice. She hugs me goodbye, and I can feel the healthy thickness of her flesh, its generosity. Thank you.
And then of the other two, the bittersweet like pomegranates was originally called The Execution, and I wrote it inspired by a famous painting by Manet, which is in the National Gallery, and it's huge. It's nearly sort of life-size characters, and it's the execution squad of the Emperor Maximilian, who was a sort of puppet emperor put in by the French when they were occupying Mexico. And the characters in it, you're seeing the execution squad from the back, and when you're up there right in front of you, they're that close to the foreground, and they're all got their weapons aimed at the emperor, who's on either side of him are his generals, 2 of his generals, and it's very sort of hazy because the gun has been fired, so it's very smoky. And I've always been fascinated by this painting. I think it's a very interesting painting anyway. It had a lot of political influences at the time, which made it very controversial. And it was actually cut up. And when you go there, you can see it's been reassembled. Degas, I think it was, went around and bought all the separate bits and had them all pulled together again. There are lots of versions of it. But what struck me was, while in war, when you're a soldier, you signed up to be a soldier, you're all in a body of people who are doing something supposedly to protect your country, whatever. But in an execution, you're being asked to kill somebody in cold blood who can't defend themselves, and whether you agree with what they've done or not. And I was imagining what it would feel like to be one of those people and how that might change you. So in my story, I wanted one of the executioners to have been somehow transformed by this experience of having to look someone in the eye and kill them. So I was able to read up quite a lot. There was quite a lot of eyewitness accounts of the execution, and I spent a lot of time in Mexico, so I was able to kind of bring in that sort of background. But then I thought, well, what would make it even more meaningful is if the executioner has a child, because the child would see things in a different way, would not, would have a different idea about death, you know, then it wouldn't be something that you just have to accept. So that was, and yeah, it was one of the stories I was very proud of, actually, for lots of reasons. But it's quite different from the others I've written, I think, anyway. And finally, I think, the last story, the most recent one, DFL. DFL, for those of you who don't know, is if you live outside of London in Hastings, they refer to anyone who's come down from London as a DFL, down from London. There's another much more rude acronym, which is filth. Failed in London, try Hastings. But we all, I've changed that to fab in London, try Hastings. But so DFL, when I first moved down here, people would use this term in a very pejorative way. And I kept thinking, well, how would it, you know, if you're younger and you move down here and one person wants to move down here and one person doesn't want to move down here, what would you see in this town that you would hate and that would contrast? And how would you get over that? How would you deal with that? So I had fun with, you know, because like many seaside towns, there's, if you want to see kind of like, you know, human catastrophe, you can see it everywhere, and there's less of the kind of you know, brightness of youth that you get in university towns to contrast. So anyway, so that was my character. I didn't want to be down there, had worked in Christie's where she didn't fit in, but somehow was trying to scrabble up that ladder, but her boyfriend wants to move nearer his ailing father. And then I was able to shoehorn in an incident that had happened on a bus, which I really experienced, into this story, where I was sitting with some people on this bus, you know, the normal kind of assorted people you get on a bus down in Hastings, and a woman, a woman who I thought maybe might be Filipina, got on with her child, and they were sitting on one side, and another sort of local young woman got in with her, you know, little girl, and these two children opposite the aisle just sort of fell in love with each other, and they were holding hands across the aisle, and every time anyone tried to get in or out, they would separate longingly and then join their hands together. And it started this conversation on the bus with people behind me that were saying, oh, it's just like that film South Pacific, don't you remember, where he has these children who are mixed race and everybody's horrible. Oh, and then this other man joined in, yes, but if you go work in the nursery where I go, you know, just behind my house, you see these children, it doesn't matter what colour they are, they all hanging together. Suddenly the bus was all liberal sort of, and all the things that people had said to me about, oh, it's not diverse down there, you'll never see a black face and all this kind of thing. I thought, I mean, this bus with all these liberals, it was really funny. So I thought, well, in a way, what was fun was to have her, the visitor, who's mixed race, coming down with all this kind of like, oh, I don't want to be part of this kind of environment, and suddenly being out liberaled by the people she was despising around her and represented by these two children. So that was, again, quite a nice thing to take a real situation that I'd experienced and put it into that story. So so that was quite a fun thing to write as well, in a way. So yeah, so there you go, that's my 5, but yeah, written a few more since then.
That was actually going to be my next question to all and any of you, is what are you working on at the moment? And also, perhaps later, if anybody's got any questions for each other, we'll throw that in as well. But since you're there already, Joan, do you want to start?
So I've been doing an MA at Chichester in creative writing, and I have written a few stories as part of that. And I decided to try and write 2 stories which were completely the opposite of Write What You Know. So I wanted to write about a gay man coming out as gay, which and I wanted to write about an immigrant in Mexico who's male, which I did. I wrote both those stories, and that was a very interesting experience to see about taking the truth of the phrase write what you know, but talking about emotional truth rather than actual physical truth. So I had experienced the feeling of being out of my town. I had experienced homesickness. I experienced grief of losing somebody. So I thought, well, can I give somebody who isn't me these emotions? So I did that. And with the story of the gay man was interesting because obviously I have had friends who come out, so I have had their experiences. But I wrote it twice. I wrote it once as a gay man, and I wrote it again as if I was a woman who had coming out as gay. So that was quite an interesting experience, and I wrote about that as an experience. Interestingly, one of those stories just got shortlisted or finalist in the Mamaya Press international competition, which was really good, and along with another one. So I wrote one set in Deptford, actually, about angels in Deptford. You've written, I think Helen's written one about angels, but I wanted to write about what if we all are born of angels, but we never remember it, so that we don't know that actually it's this sort of input that's made us here, and because we don't remember it, we don't appreciate what we are. So that, again, that was all set in Deptford. Housewives cash and carry department, but supermarket, and it was great to use what I knew of that place. So I've done those, and now I'm trying to work on two things: a novel, which I'm in the midst of. That's all I can say about that. And then I've written a rhyming children's sort of poem fable, which has been fun to write, all set by the seaside. So yeah, that's me.
Thanks, Joan. Cassandra, because I'm aware that
the last story I wrote with a very quick turnaround was the one that was in MIR, the Mechanics Institute Review, which is the Birkbeck publication, which is called Empty Pockets, and it was about coronavirus. And on the night of lockdown, a party that happened in a house where it began to dawn on everybody in North London that things were going to change quite substantially. People were already, I think it was the 13th, when people realised they were going to be losing their jobs and what the implications were for Londoners. But more generally, I'm working on a collection for my PhD, which is called The 3 Marks of Impermanence or Existence, which include impermanence, non-self and suffering, which are Buddhist sort of labels for the 3 ways that you can define being alive. I don't know, I didn't write the stories to fit into the categories. I had stories that I had been working on over time, and I was trying to find parallels between the experience of mindful attention and writing short fiction. So I was looking at other people's work and beginning to apply some of those concepts that were kind of coming to the surface with my own work. And these 3 kind of fit neatly into the work I was doing. So yeah, my stories have sort of revolved around those 3 themes, which I'm sure if everybody looked at their short stories, they could easily find impermanence, some form of suffering or seeking of, escaping suffering. And non-self is really, in the Buddhist world, is a precursor to the whole identity thing, who we are and whether we exist independently of ourselves, and how other people perceive us, and how Buddhists believe that everything that comes together and disintegrates is not real, which includes fiction, which is why I find it so interesting. It's fiction, real life, and all those parallels and spin-offs, that connection. So it's yeah, for me, it's been a very interesting last couple of years. I'm just in my final year now. It's almost like a rabbit hole that you can go down and never come out of endless possibilities and parallels and differences. So yeah, that's what I'm doing at the moment.
Thanks.
I'm actually working on it was a short story, and then it was maybe going to be a novella, and now it's probably going to be longer than that. So that's all I've been doing for the last writing period. I was just trying to think, actually, the last short story I wrote was for my writing group, just because I think I stepped into the breach, someone couldn't submit that week. And I was like, oh, okay, I've got an idea. I think it's going to be really short. And I'm usually terrible at thinking, it'll be 2,000 words, it ends up 5,000. So I always overshoot. But in this case, I think I managed to, write furiously and, hit about 2100 or something like that. So I was really pleased for a start that it was the right length. It's called The Astronaut, and it's about a girl who wants to be an astronaut and can't. And it's, yeah, I mean, I'm more aware now of writing female protagonists, partly because of Liars League. I just was completely unaware until we had to have stories performed by actors, and sometimes we'd have like 15 actresses available and 2 actors, and you realise that you're stuck in that Shakespeare dichotomy of having all the talent in one gender, well, not all of it, most of it, in one gender, and all the parts in the other. So I was very consciously writing, trying, if I thought to myself, well, I'm going to write a story about a doctor or a cowboy or whatever it is, or a cow person, if there was no good reason that character couldn't be female, then I would make that character female, and often it made the story much more interesting. So anyway, it's a little girl who kind of dreams of space and rockets, to some extent inspired by small boys who dream of space and rockets as well as trains. And she has a kind of medical condition which means that she can't go up in space. It's too dangerous. So the mother makes it her kind of life's mission to give her the astronaut experience without ever being able to live it for real. So it's a little bit about dreams and ambitions and what you do if you can't have what you want. And it's a little bit about parents who will try and fulfill whatever their child's desire is, even when it's not necessarily possible, maybe not even good for that child, because this girl just goes to pretend astronaut training, but she's not going to be an astronaut. So what happens to her life? Really, it's sort of a kind of false consciousness, but nonetheless, she's happy, but it's kind of a dream. So it's all about that. And then there's like a bit of a twist at the end, but yeah, it was interesting. It's one of those things where you have it in your head for ages and you're like, oh, write that next, I'll write that next. And then you don't get around to writing it, and then you have a deadline and all of a sudden you have to do it in a night. So I was glad to get it down. But I'm doing kind of some gothic horror kind of longer stuff at the moment. So that's the only thing I'm allowed to spend my time on. I've got another idea about a Western story that I really want to write. I'm not allowed to write it until I've done August of like doing lots of work on this longer piece.
Is that the one that you were doing in audio over a month?
Oh no, it's connected actually. No, that was done 2 summers ago. Also in August. That was the Woodways one. So it's folklore kind of horror, kind of M.R. James inspired. This one's more like Lovecraft from a feminine perspective. It's kind of Mary Riley meets Herbert West reanimator. Yeah, we'll see what happens to it, but I've been giving bits of it to the writing group, and again, a lot of people are like, oh, this is the one I like best, so I thought I would just keep going, see what happens. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Helen.
So I've been flat out with work, unfortunately, since lockdown started, and it's not easing yet, and it won't for a while. So I haven't written anything for ages. And when Joan mentioned the change, I thought, oh, that was the last thing I wrote, which is the Angels are the Baddies and Menopausal Women are the Superheroes story, which obviously I'm very partial to for very personal reasons. But actually it wasn't. The last thing I think I wrote was the thing for No Spider Harmed in the Making of This Book, which again was another sort of riff, a twisted riff on a superhero story. So a bit like The Change, but also not like The Change. So I think that was the last thing I wrote. But interestingly, when we launched 5 by 5, I hadn't written anything for probably well over a year. And because I got so excited again about writing and being back with writers, and I did write The Change straight after that, which is why Aunt Cherry in that story is named after Cherry, because I thought, hooray, I've been inspired to be creative again, and not just get sucked into work. So actually I'm feeling like that again today. One thing I would definitely do is reread 5 by 5, because I absolutely made sure I read it before the launch, because I thought, oh no, I'll be talking to the actual people, so I have to read everything. So I did my homework then, but I just remember enjoying it so much and sitting out in the garden and laughing and crying as I read it, and feeling very moved and inspired by it. So my drought will definitely have to end again, because however busy you are, you can always find time, even when you're doing other things, to at least think of ideas. And you know, I'm sure I've got jotted down long lists of stuff, some of which is incomprehensible. I had a very pinty evening, if I can describe it in that way, with a friend, and find out I'd put myself in my little digital notebook something that said something like bees, but with the superpower of bees, which I've got absolutely no idea what it meant, but I'm sure it was absolutely brilliant. And one day I will remember what it was going to be about, and we will have a bee story. But yes, I will definitely write something again after this.
Sounds like you need to be in a writers group.
Yes, I would love to be in a writers group. But
we could start one online.
Once I've got the boys out the way, so my middle one is starting uni in this September, so obviously that's flat out, particularly as he's autistic. And then I've just got the little one to, well, he's not little, he's 6'1" or something. Get him through A levels, and then hopefully I'll have a bit more time. Although actually going, you know, having had all 3 of them back home for the whole of lockdown, I think once 2 of them go, certainly the amount they eat, so even just replenishing the fridge is a full time, because they're all well over 6 foot and they sort of loom about eating non-stop. But once that's out of the way, I think I will definitely have more time. But yes, I do need to try and put a bit more structure around my writing rather than just squeezing it in. Also less washing, I'll have much less washing, which is a good thing.
Okay, does anybody want to ask each other questions? Yes, Joan.
I'm just it's just an interesting thing really, when Katie was talking about this story about the girl who wants to be an astronaut. Now this novel I'm writing is about a child who thinks they're from another planet and is hoping to go up into space in order to meet her family, and you're the third person I've met who's writing a story about people going into outer space, and I wondered why that's something. And in fact my tutor as well told me he's writing a collection of stories inspired by UFO sightings, and I'm thinking, what is going on? That this seems to be something in the atmosphere. It's a UFO. But, you know, this idea of is it to do with the Elon Musk and, you know, the possibility that we really can now go up there, or is it just wanting to get away from this hellhole of Putin and Trump, or what? You know, what do you think? I don't think anyone had an opinion on that. Katie, what set you off on that?
Yeah, well, it wasn't SpaceX actually, or that it was written a bit before that, because, you know, then I started going back to the novella, so it was several months ago. No, in fact, I mean, it's very much about not being an astronaut. It's about being earthbound, about, you know, that being sort of a metaphor for anything that you desperately want and can try as hard as you can if you're not right for it. A sleeping cat, okay, fantastic. They've got a treasure hunt here in this holiday house, so yeah, this has been deployed. Yeah, I've always loved sci-fi and space fiction and, you know, anything like that anyway. So it did involve me like going on the NASA website a lot and looking for kind of space camps. So that was really enjoyable. But I don't know, I mean, I think, yes, there is a resurgence of the idea that ordinary people could go to space. So it was like Virgin Galaxy ages ago, maybe about 7 or 8 years ago, where that kind of plane flew just outside the atmosphere. But I mean, Musk is the real thing, isn't he? I mean, it's commercial spaceflight effectively. So yes, the idea that was once something possible became almost impossible for a long time, for, you know, a generation basically. there's been one British astronaut in the whole history of space exploration. So, you know, good luck with that. 2 now. Oh, there's 2. You're right. Yeah, because there's Helen thingy, and then there's Chris. Yes. Okay. So there've been 2. But you know, your chances are not great unless you're American or Russian. And then all of a sudden it is again. It's a possibility again. It wouldn't really help the girl in my story because the G forces would burst her heart. But anyone else, you know, do the right training, study physics, engineering, all the rest of it, you've got a chance. But yeah, it is coming closer, isn't it? It's coming closer to being just a kind of general possibility for ordinary people, which is great. Another what if.
Anybody else? Any questions for each other?
Joan, I didn't hear some of the. No, I did hear some of the thing about the last piece that you wrote, but are both of you? I know, Joan, you've written a novel, haven't you? The Bird Slippers. Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
But if you write longer and shorter fiction, do you kind of have to do them in sequence, or do you do them in parallel? Do you work on different projects at the same time? And if you only write shorter fiction, are you sometimes cheating on one short story with another, or kind of letting them inform each other? I'm just curious about the process.
That's interesting. I mean, I do find the whole novel form much more difficult than the short story form, and because I think it's about marathon runners versus sprinters, and I think I'm more of a sprinter. Maybe that was true in reality, but anyway. But I think I generally, I do actually find that I can work on the novel and work on a short story. They feel such different things to me, and in fact, sometimes by writing the short story might free up some brain idea where if I'm stuck on the novel. So I do find that I can write separate things, and which is actually really helpful, because the novel is very hard. I used to be kind of, like all young writers are, very disparaging about people who weren't Dostoevsky, who wrote like airport novels like they were something dreadful. Now I bow down to anyone who actually writes any kind of novel. It's so hard. Yeah. Like, but I do. So I can work on different short stories at the same time. I think I've got different sort of sections in my brain that will allow me to do that.
Are you writing a novel right now then?
Yes, so the one I'm writing about, the girl, so my story is a girl who is
the alien,
defectives. She's got a medical, because she's got home for defectives in the 40s, so it's at the end of the war. So it's about what happened at the end of the war when because the scientists from Germany and scientists from Japan were being pulled into America to make use of what they had discovered and found out through nefarious testing of human beings, and how before Nuremberg forced its will on scientists, people wanted to carry on experimenting on humans in order to beat Russia in the space game. So it's kind of that's the background, the space background. But my story, so my story is told through a girl who becomes convinced that because she's so peculiar in appearance, it must be because she's come from outer space, and her mother will be looking for her. So if she gets space,
is it YA or is it an adult?
No, it is an adult, and the other characters in it are a space scientist who's wrestling with himself about both wanting to be, somebody marvelous and live on his name to live on in the annals of space, whilst also recognizing that what he's doing is ethically dubious. And then a young woman who's just wanted to live an extremely bohemian, decadent life, and then has that illusion shattered by what happens during the war. So it's a kind of, and I don't quite know how to tell this story. 3 different characters. I don't know how to weave them all together. But it's really the research, and when you were talking about the research, it takes you into areas just so fascinating. I've learned all sorts of amazing things, but anyway, whether I'll ever get it finished, I don't know, but that's the idea.
Oh well, I'll read it if you do.
Thank you.
For sure, it sounds brilliant. How about you, Helen? Do you also write long form, Helen?
No, I don't. It just sounds like too much hard work.
Wise.
So I just, I am I think I said to Joan when we did the interviews, a pantser in that I sort of, you know, come in, it's like Simon Le Bon will save us, you know, 40 minutes, bang, that's done, a bit of fiddling.
Wow.
And then I'm done with it. So I have quite a short attention span. So and the idea of doing research, I have to say, is just having to sound like hard work.
Well,
So unless something miraculous happens, I will not be writing anything. It's just not how my brain is. So I enjoy. Sorry, go on.
And I was just going to say, do you have the idea and then pretty much immediately have to get it down, or do you let them kind of percolate for a while?
I let them percolate normally, because I sort of will have the idea and it'll stew away, and I just don't make time for writing for whatever reason, and then I will just sit down and then it will come, and that could be anything from the change. You know, I think I'd had that thought for 15 years, 20 years probably, you know, I'm watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer. How come it's only teenagers who get superpowers? Why can't it be, you know, menopause? Why do they get all the good stuff? You know, so that's sort of actually, and there's, you know, there was a great series that my sons loved called the Sarah Jane Adventures, where the protagonist was a middle-aged woman. She took on baddies with her handbag. It was glorious, and there were so few good lead roles for women in their 50s that was part of it. So again, it's that sort of thing. So, you know, loads of really weird ideas sloshing about all the time in my brain, and then something will trigger me sitting down and writing something, and so that one will pop out. And again, it's not fully formed, so I'll normally bash out something pretty rough but end to end. And I also have to write the bits I enjoy first. So if I know how something's going to end, but I don't know how it's going to start, I will write the ending first, because the worst thing for me is I can't make myself do something I don't want to, which is why I've got so many cobwebs in the house. So I have to sort of trick myself into doing it by doing the bits I like.
Doing the fun stuff, yeah, and filling the rest later.
That sort of thing. So yes.
Cool.
I think you're in good company, because I heard Hilary Mantel on one of the Wreath lectures talking about how she writes just the scenes that she likes. That's what she writes, and then she works out how they can all fit together. So
Brilliant.
Not Running by Sarah James. Have you talked to Simon? My voice gusts onto the winter air like unsteady cartoon speech bubbles as I try to run and chat. Thursday, when he's back. Kath has no trouble balancing breath and words. You have to tell him about Ben. I guess. Kath's voice is vibrant. Too vibrant. But I don't have chance to probe. My words are few. Gasped. 15 minutes into our usual route, it starts to snow. Small cold kisses at first, but 10 minutes later the path is layered white. Distant trees become pastel lines, then disappear into sky. We turn back. Our pace slows from jaunty jog to dragging slog. My face is numb. Even Kath stops talking. She brushes a hair from her eyes. Her sleeve falls down, revealing new bruises. She catches my glance. Her expression says, "It's nothing." I disagree. But now's not a time for questions. The path has turned into one long white treadmill. We concentrate on each step, raising our feet like mechanical pistons, pushing against the wind, barely moving. Eventually we reach Kath's house, dark and empty. She closes the door and I shock her hall into light. Rodney the monkey is having a fit, and maybe more ill than the park keeper thought. Someone has left the television booming in the living room. Sometimes it's Kath's son, Ben, gone out in a rush. Other times she leaves it on for company when Ben's with his dad, Simon. We flop, shivering, onto chairs. The kitchen fills with our breathing and the agitated monkey's distant screeching. I look across at Kath and her bruised wrist. Thursday. I'll tell Simon about Ben on Thursday. Kath sounds so definite, but I see her arm tremble. Oh, Kath. She looks up, her eyes the colour of the morning sky just before the snow fell. Then she turns away. He's my son, Mel. My son.